In 3 sentences or less, identify what, where, when, and or why each of the following are important. So kind of looking at some definition of terms here, and I'm going to try to get through these relatively quickly and just give you kind of a sense of the kind of information I was looking for here. So the Navigation Acts, they were a series of acts intended to regulate the commerce of the colonies. The Navigation Acts were really sort of part of that economic philosophy of mercantilism we were talking about, where primarily they were trying to funnel all trade from the colonies to the British. So British goods traded to the colonies had to come in on British ships. The ships transporting the goods had to have like a certain percentage of British merchants and sailors on them. So trying to make sure that if anything was going to be going to or from the colonies, it was going to be passing through British customs, giving money to the British government, and kind of in that way, very much restricting the trade of the colonies. And that was sort of on paper the way that they envisioned the colonies. The next term, salutary neglect, is sort of more of what the reality was. And this was really the ability of colonists to defy or ignore laws or those acts in the Navigation Acts that they didn't necessarily like, that they could get around, they could smuggle and still sort of bring these goods in underneath the nose of the British. And the British, to a certain degree, knew this was going on. And it was sort of evident of the sort of the traditional relationship between the colonists, where the colonists had a lot of leadway. They had their own sort of governing systems that even though there was sort of a royally appointed governor, they had their own assemblies that they were creating. And in that sense, that they had a lot of ability to sort of choose what laws they wanted to sort of enforce very strictly and which ones they didn't. And a lot of times the British authorities in the colonies for quite a while were okay with that. They didn't want to sort of stir the pot and create more trouble. And this led to a sort of a relationship where the colonists had a very large degree of autonomy. And that's something that they very much had come accustomed to. So once the British government starts to increase their level of sort of authority and starts to enforce it to a degree that they hadn't in the past, that's going to be one of the reasons why it does seem like it's such a shift and a change to the colonists, and one of the reasons why a lot of them are so angry at it. Moving on to the Sugar Act, which is a good example of this. This was essentially one of Grenville's first attempts at taxation. We'll get into this a little bit more in future questions, but of course they're trying to make up some of the losses that they had occurred and the debt that they had occurred during the 7 Years' War. They decided to tax the colonies, and this is kind of the first attempt to do that. The Sugar Act wasn't just a taxation on sugar, it was also coffee, coconuts, whale fins, silk, animal hides, a wide range of goods. This is important because essentially it's sort of the first resistance that it starts coming from the colony towards this taxation. Because it wasn't a direct tax, it was essentially a taxation on imports and exports. It didn't directly affect a lot of the colonists, so there wasn't a huge uprising against this, but there was pushback in some of the colonial assemblies. And certainly it raised a lot of eyebrows in the colonies. Because it was being imposed and enforced in a way that sort of previous laws necessarily had not, and it was sort of a warning sign. The Proclamation of 1763. This really sort of was an attempt by the British government to repair the relationship with American Indians after Pontiac's rebellion. They realized that a lot of the motivation for the rebellion and uprising had been incursions into American Indian lands by British colonists. And they certainly were still trying to profit off of the fur trade. Remember, when now the French had been removed from North America, the British were sort of the primary movers of the fur trade. They didn't want to have another or more long protracted wars. The 7 Years' War had been costly enough. That's the entire reason they're trying to impose this new taxation. So the Proclamation of 1763 was an attempt to really sort of just make a peace with American Indians and let them know that no more British colonists are going to be settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, essentially forbid the colonists from settling. This is very important because it's going to be another tension point between the colonists and the British government. The colonists, of course, increasingly want more and more land at the expense of American Indians. They're pushing farther and farther west. And they're going to want to certainly move past the Appalachian Mountains into areas like the Ohio River Valley and continue their own push for increased territory and increased land. And certainly they do not like the restrictions that the British government is putting in play here, even though that is going to certainly be getting the British government more support from American Indian groups. And when we get to the time period of the Revolution here, talking next week, it's not going to be surprising that the majority of American Indian groups, not all of them, but the majority of them are going to side with the British in the conflict. Moving on to the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act was essentially a British response to the Stamp Act protests, where they, definitely saw more pushback against the taxation that they're trying to levy. Formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty and some of the violent actions that they were taking against tax collectors and people who were trying to enforce the laws. And this was sort of the British government flexing its muscles to a certain degree. It was requiring colonists to provide lodging for British troops. This didn't necessarily mean they had to be in the same house, but it meant that they had to feed them, maybe have another building on the property that British troops could stay in. And this is also sort of a continuation of the decision to keep a standing army in the colonies after the 7 Years' War, where that really hadn't been the case. And another reason why it just sort of increased the fear of sort of tyrannical rule on the part of the colonists, that there had never been this huge military presence of the British in the colonies before. That seemed like that was increasing. And the fact that they could have British troops essentially stationed in anyone's house that they sort of wanted, even though that's not really how it played out or how it was being implemented, sort of the threat of that was seen as very troublesome to a lot of the colonists. The Townshend duties were sort of the first taxation after the Declaratory Acts. Of course, the Stamp Act eventually gets repealed due to all these boycotts and protests. But after, or along with repealing it, the British government also passes the Declaratory Act, which pretty much says the British government can tax the colonies as much as they want because the colonies are British subjects. And the Townshend duties was kind of the first attempt to enforce that. So it was a tax on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. So it's sort of a wide range of items. And this led to just sort of another round of boycotts, of protests, and was eventually repealed as well. Most of them, most of the taxes were repealed. I believe tea was the one thing that the taxes remained on. But even though the boycotts were not quite as, I would say, intense as they were around the Stamp Act, they were still effective enough to get it repealed. The Sons of Liberty were a group of merchants and craftsmen who were determined to fight these taxation. It contained a lot of sort of people who were eventually going to be very influential, for example, Samuel Adams, and a lot of the people who felt like they were the most targeted by these taxes, which are primarily merchants, tradesmen, typically more upper class people in the Northeast. They were the ones who were really sort of feeling the impacts of this, and it's not surprising that they were the ones who were leading a lot of the pushback. They did a lot of things to try to get these taxes removed, from petitions to the British government, encouraging protests, organizing the boycotts, which were very effective. But they'd also use intimidation and violence. They'd attack tax collectors. They burned down the house of the Massachusetts governor. And you could really see that these weren't purely peaceful protests and protesters. They were very much willing to use and engage in intimidation and violence in order to accomplish their goals. This is very important because on the one hand it sort of helps repeal some of the taxes. You can see that it is in a certain case being effective, but at the same point in time, every time it's effective, it's ratcheting up the tensions. It's making the British government more and more wary of this pushback, the note or the tone that it is taking, the violence that is now happening with it. And the next time the British come back, it's always upping the ante because they're always coming back with either more taxes or more regulations or sort of more heavy-handed responses, which is just going to sort of bring both sides closer and closer to the point where the war is going to break out. Regulators were essentially a group of North Carolina colonists who armed themselves once more in sort of protest to the taxes. They marched against essentially militia troops supporting the colonial government, and were eventually able to destroy the houses of the governor and the superior judge in North Carolina. And once more, this is a sign to the British that the protests and the sort of random acts of violence that they saw earlier were beginning to become sort of outright armed resistance, and is very much going to be dictating the increasing severity of the response on the side of the British. And one more term, virtual representation. This, of course, is sort of the British response to the colonial argument that they're not represented in the British government, so the British government has sort of no right to tax them. The British argument was essentially that all British citizens are represented by Parliament, by the upper and lower houses, and that essentially in that way, yes, you are being represented, even though the colonists didn't have a direct say in who those representatives were going to be. So that's kind of a go-between in that sort of political argument that was taking place during this time. All right, we got through them all. Why did the British government decide to use the American colonies to pay down its debt? Was this a reasonable plan for the British to enact? What were the main arguments colonists used to object to the increased taxes imposed by Parliament? So yeah, I mean, the biggest reason that the British government decides to increase the taxation on the American colonies is the financial crisis, which is essentially sparked by the 7 Years' War. Of course, to win the war, the British government had to massively invest, building more ships, hiring mercenaries, and sort of doing everything they could to fight the French on a global setting. And this eventually is going to lead the British government with about 123 million pounds of debt. So one way that they decide to try to pay down that debt is to begin to increase the taxation on the colonies. The colonies had been far less taxed than sort of the British citizens living in Britain, particularly the middle and lower classes of Great Britain, as well as some of the other colonies that the British had. And we sort of talked about in our definitions before the salutary neglect and so forth, where the American colonies always sort of had that kind of special relationship with the British government. And this was essentially an effort to try to bring the American colonies sort of more in line with the empire as a whole, and in doing so, trying to pay down some of that debt. Other reasoning behind this was that essentially the 7 Years' War began in the colonies. Remember, it was sort of George Washington messing around in the Ohio River Valley on behest of the Virginia colonial government. Is eventually going to spark the war that is, like I said, last week virtually turns into a First World War that the British are having to fight. So they thought that because the war started there, and also because quite a bit of resources were put into defending and protecting the colonies during the war, and that in theory the colonies very much benefited from the British winning the war, that it didn't seem unreasonable to the British politicians and a lot of people in Great Britain in general to bring the colonies, like I said, sort of more in line with with how they were taxing and engaging economically with other portions of their empire. A lot of you thought that it was a unreasonable plan, particularly because of what happened. But it's important to note they were talking about the intent to begin with. They didn't have that knowledge, right? Like they knew that they would probably be unpopular. They did not realize that this was eventually going to lead down the rabbit hole of American independence. So at the time, it probably seemed like a very reasonable plan, right? Like the American colonies did sort of enjoy this special relationship that they had, had sort of put them aside from other portions of the British Empire. In that case, they essentially could have said that the American colonies had not been sort of paying their fair share to the empire, especially when the empire had spent so much resources to protect them. So from the British mindset, it probably seemed like an incredibly reasonable plan to engage. Of course, the colonists saw it as no such thing. They really saw it as a violation of that traditional relationship. They really did see themselves as kind of a special unit within the British Empire. And of course, this sort of goes back to sort of the exceptionalism that the colonies started with. That entire sort of concept of the city upon the hill and how the colonies were sort of this sort of separate entity. And even though some of the religious aspects of that had been or weren't quite as prominent at this point in time, there was still definitely, I would say, a perception among the colonists that they were sort of the special colonies, that they were sort of the wealthiest colonies. They had the highest percentage of sort of British citizens living outside of Great Britain. And that they very much sort of enjoyed that easy relationship that, the British can pass these laws, we don't really need to follow them, we have our own colonial assemblies. The British sort of let us do our own thing, and once it becomes clear that that's no longer going to be the case, you see more and more resentment and more pushback. And of course, we'll be talking about in a little while that this is going to be happening at the same time that those ideas and ideologies of the Enlightenment are very much giving a voice to these protests. So the idea of representation within government had become more and more popular and more important. It was being utilized to a certain degree in those colonial assemblies. Of course, those colonial assemblies memberships would have been very much restricted to land-owning males. So we're not talking about sort of a universal representation. But it's going to be those people who had toyed around with those ideas of self-determination and representation of government who are very much going to be putting forward that argument that since the American colonies did not have seats in the lower house of Commons within the British government, they did not have a direct say in the passing of these laws, that these laws should not then apply to them. Of course, the British government is going to shoot back, saying, well, started by that theory, the British government, would not be able to rule or regulate any of their colonies, and that, that's where that argument of virtual representation comes in. That through the British Parliament, everyone is sort of represented underneath that because the Parliament is operating in the best interest of all of Great Britain, not just one particular area or location. So you certainly see an ideological rift forming between the British and the colonists, and that really that ideological shift is being given voice to by those Enlightenment ideas. Another kind of aspect that really causes the colonists to push back, and you got to really look at the who within colonial society is pushing back, and the groups that are going to be the most vocal, the groups that are going to be organizing, these are essentially going to be upper class. It's going to be wealthy merchants, it's going to be lawyers, it's going to be bankers, it's going to be wealthy craftsmen, it's going to be the plantation owners in the southern colonies. And that all these sort of colonial elites very much, if you remember a few weeks ago, wanted to view themselves as sort of on par or on level with the British nobility, with the British aristocracy. And in the British government, one of the benefits of being essentially a British noble is that you did not pay taxes. Taxes were supposed to be levied on the lower classes, essentially. And quite honestly, this is one of the biggest reasons why these taxes were seen as so offensive to the colonists, particularly the colonial elites, is because they wanted to view themselves as being aristocratic in nature, essentially. And the fact that the British government now wanted to tax them made them feel like, well, the British government just thinks that we're essentially peasants, we're lower classes, we're not as important. And to a certain degree, it was kind of an offense to their honor, which is why, one of the reasons you see them taking such a pronounced role and force in the pushback against these various forms of taxation. So those are just some of the reasons why the British were going to begin taxing the colonies and why the colonies were going to begin pushing back on that idea, and is eventually going to spiral into a full-out crisis between the two sides. In what ways did the colonists attempt to peacefully reconcile their differences with the British monarchy? Which tactics did the colonists use that were not so peaceful? So yeah, we're really looking at the varying responses that the colonists are going to have to the taxation and sort of the increasing level of authority that the British government is going to be leveling against the colonies. So some of the first attempts to repeal these taxes are sort of using the established political structure which is available in the colonies, essentially getting the colonial assemblies to pass resolutions condemning the taxes or calling or requesting for their repeal. When that doesn't work, you see more direct appeals to either British lawmakers or directly to the king himself, sort of arguing why these taxes are unjust or why the colonists feel that they are unjust or unfair, and requesting the British government to essentially change their mind and to repeal them. A step further from sort of that, then you have essentially lobbying efforts. You have people in Great Britain who are arguing on behalf of the colonists, who are, meeting with the members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and trying to essentially get them and convince them to change their minds on these taxations. Benjamin Franklin, for example, is going to be living in Great Britain during this time period, and he's very much going to be working with and coordinating with various representatives in the British government to try to sway them to the side of the colonists. And certainly British merchants are going to play a very large part in this sort of go-between between the colonists and the British government, because of course the British government is sort of very much dependent upon the success of these British merchants, and the British merchants certainly see that the taxes, and not necessarily the taxes, but the protests sparked by them are negatively impacting their own businesses. And one of the key aspects of that, and just sort of another peaceful way of protesting, were the boycotts, essentially saying if you want to tax these items, no one in the colonies is going to buy them, or we're going to make sure that people in the colonies are going to buy very few of these items, so you're not going to be getting your taxes, the merchants aren't going to be making their money. And this is very much going to then lead to those merchants to start putting pressure on the British government, saying, hey, we're losing money through all this, you're not getting your taxes, these policies obviously aren't going to work, so you should think about repealing them. And ultimately that's going to be pretty effective. That's probably the most effective tool that the colonists ultimately are able to level against these taxes. And you do see a number of them getting repealed. For example, the Stamp Act, large portions of the Townshend Acts are going to be repealed thanks in part to the coordinated efforts and boycotts that the colonists are going to be organizing. You also see peaceful protests and demonstrations, essentially trying to encourage public support for these boycotts and rile up sort of anger against the taxes. Those are very much going to be common as well. But there are plenty of tactics that are going to be used that are not so peaceful. We already talked about some of the tactics that the Sons of Liberty are using, particularly targeting local officials, targeting their houses, tar and feathering them, which is a pretty awful, incredibly painful, sometimes lethal thing that you can do to a person. Intimidating British agents, and also just intimidating fellow citizens to make sure that they're not actually buying the things that you are boycotting. So those certainly are using violence or the threat of violence in order to try to enforce sort of your perspective. Much more violent protests are also common, and it's during those protests oftentimes that there's destruction of property, buildings are going to be burned, homes are attacked, and certainly that's going to be one of the elements that's going to lead to something like the Boston Massacre, for example, where a protest sort of gets out of hand and people start throwing snowballs and then rocks and bottles at British soldiers who open fire on a crowd. And is really going to be sort of a hallmark of the escalating crisis in the colonies. Eventually, you're going to see much more sort of direct action. For example, in response to the Tea Act, you're going to see the Sons of Liberty organizing the Boston Tea Party, in which case they're going to be sort of breaking the rules and regulations about not assembling, so sort of breaking a curfew that was in place, and certainly just going down to the port and, what we'd probably consider today destroying property, taking that British tea off of those British ships, dumping it in the water, ruining it, and destroying it. And of course, that's going to lead to a huge pushback from the British with the Declaratory Acts, which is going to be essentially locking Boston down, putting Boston under military law, or martial law, if you might want to think of it that way. And it's going to be, of course, in response to that, you see an increase then in armed resistance by the colonists. You see the regulators in Carolina taking up arms. You see the local militias around Boston beginning to arm themselves for an increased conflict. And it's based off of that, then you're going to see the very first battles of the Revolutionary War occur, the battles of Lexington and Concord, where the British are essentially going to go out to try to find one of these stockpilings of arms in the surrounding area, and are going to be very much attacked and sort of whittled down on their attempt to get back to Boston. And that's really sort of where the military portion of the war begins. So you can really sort of see a pattern in a lot of these where a tax is imposed. There's protest and resentment and pushback. Some of it's peaceful. The tax eventually is repealed, but there's also these violent elements of the protests, which, while the taxes might be repealed, is going to increase the level of authority that the British are going to be trying to levy, because the British government doesn't want to be pushed around either, right? That's where sort of the declaratory acts, sort of came into play, and that was to try to, tell the colonists that, no, you're still British citizens, so you need to sort of follow the rules. British citizens, or the colonists, are certainly not going to be necessarily following the rules to the same extent, and increasingly are going to be breaking them as the tensions increase. And yeah, I mean, you can certainly see that these are going to be protests. They're going to eventually be violent protests, and they're eventually going to be sort of armed military uprising and resistance. That's going to be leading to the Revolutionary War, which we'll be covering next week. But I think it's something important to keep in mind that, especially when we're talking about sort of modern day civil unrest and so forth, that some people seem to have this idea that any form of non-peaceful protest is in some way, shape, or form un-American. And you can have certainly lots of objections or conversations about civil unrest and the protests and the part that should play. Is it useful? Does it just harm a cause? But the idea that the simple nature of not being peaceful is somehow un-American is somewhat laughable, seeing as how without the violent protests and the build-up to the Revolutionary War, we probably wouldn't have a country. And that's just sort of a simple fact. Explain what role the European Enlightenment played in the decision of the colonists to pursue American independence. To a large degree, the Enlightenment very much gave the resistance and pushback and the alienation that the colonists were feeling against Great Britain. It gave it a ideology and a language and a rationality to the resistance. For example, the entire concept of liberty, which was so much entwined with the complaints of the colonists, was very much itself an Enlightenment idea in the form that they were using. And one of the reasons why this sort of Enlightenment thinking was so common and prevalent and impactful was for a couple things. First of all, that education in the colonies was there's a much higher degree of a percentage of the population who had some level of education than you would have seen in a lot of European countries and in Great Britain. And particularly among the educated class going to, college and the colleges at that point in time, who were primarily going to be lawyers or doctors or in the clergy, those Enlightenment ideas were very prevalent. So a lot of the sort of upper class who ends up coming to lead the revolution were very familiar with those concepts and those ideas of the Enlightenment, whether they were sort of exposed to it in their sort of through their formal education or just sort of from the elite groups that they were engaging with, that it sort of took hold and very much influenced the way that they began to perceive the growing conflict with Great Britain. We already mentioned sort of last week how individuals like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson could be considered sort of Enlightenment thinkers in their own right, and certainly expanded those ideas and utilized them when it came time to express and rationalize the decision to separate from Great Britain. Of course, you can look at ideas like John Locke's as being very central to this. Those ideas of life, liberty, property, the idea of representation in general was very much an Enlightenment idea. The entire argument that there should be no taxation without representation, that's coming directly from Enlightenment thinkers, essentially saying governments are essentially should be constructed by the people and should be there solely to sort of serve the needs of the people, and therefore you need the governments to be made up of representatives of the people. So very much sort of John Locke and his ideas are very, very central. You can certainly see that in the Declaration of Independence, how essentially Thomas Jefferson sort of uses that line, changes it slightly, sort of reinforces the idea of universal rights, all men are created equal, which we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment here. And it certainly changes the idea of sort of strictly property as to pursuit of happiness in the Declaration. But those ideas are already there, sort of fully formed, that they are articulating. Of course, the economic ideas I don't think should be underrepresented either. The entire idea of economic liberalism was coming into effect here, and so much of the conflict between the colonies and the empire were economic in nature, right? They were the sort of wealthier class, the business class essentially, were fighting back against that sort of mercantilist ideology and policies that the empire was still trying to run with, and essentially sort of backing up those ideas of economic liberalism. And it's important to note, particularly at this time and moving forward, in the early portions of our classes, when we're talking about terms like liberal or conservative, they likely mean very different things than they do in our modern day political context. Economic liberalism is essentially a reaction against mercantilism that is in promotion of a free market economy, saying that essentially business owners and people engaging in business should be able to trade with who they want, not having sort of everything have to be funneled through the British government, for example, and that essentially you're going to bring in a lot more wealth and profit to a nation by letting a market sort of run and regulate itself than if there's all sorts of direction from a strong centralized government or strong centralized power. So a very different conception of liberalism in this sense than what we currently have today, as those terms have sort of been changed and altered in different ways. But in this sense, talking about economic liberalism, particularly as expressed by Adam Smith, it's going to be that idea of a sort of hands-off, laissez-faire structure is ideal for economic purposes. And that's certainly something that the colonists are going to be arguing for, and one of the main reasons why another reason I should say, why they feel like those economic taxation and policies of the British are something that they are very much pushing back against. It's important to note as well, though, that certainly the limits that you see in the Enlightenment as a whole also come shining through very clearly here in the Revolution and the build-up to it, because that ideology is very much not being used equally, right? Looking back at the terminology, so much of the protests against the British were based on those ideas of liberty, and the colonists expressing outrage that they thought the British were essentially trying to enslave them and make them slaves. And this could certainly be seen as very hypocritical, seeing as how a lot of the people who are making that argument, for example, Thomas Jefferson, actually have real slaves themselves. And it really shows you that there was a incredibly conscious double standard going on. The argument that a lot of the colonists were making is, we know what slavery is so well because we have slaves and we don't want to be like them. So the ideas that they are purporting and the ideologies that they are following, they're following it with a very clear double standard in how they are perceiving it and wanting it to be applied. When they say all men are created equal, essentially what they are saying is all white men of property are being created equal at this point in time, and that is how they are perceiving it. But of course, this is going to be a very dangerous idea. Dangerous to sort of their sensibilities, I would say. I would say it's an incredibly hopeful idea for sort of humanity in general, because every new generation is going to be interpreting those words in a new light and in a new context, and increasingly that idea of these natural rights are eventually going to turn into sort of what we think of today as human rights, and we are going to be thinking them as to applying to a larger and larger group of people. But it's going to take years and years and more conflict and more violence and more drastic changes to the country to get it to the point where we are today, and how we sort of think and hear those words and perceive them and a much more broad context than the way they were originally conceived and written down. And just like the entire ideology of the Enlightenment has been broadened into that sort of universal idea of human rights that we have today, which it certainly originally was not the context that it was being used in. All right. Is there any way the Revolutionary War could have been avoided? Explain your answer. I thought there was a really good split in the answers that the class gave to this. Some people thought yes, it could. Some people thought no, it couldn't. And yeah, I really liked the arguments that both sides were putting forward. On the one hand, you can certainly see that there were lots of areas where there could have been more compromise between the two sides. Britain could have essentially backed off their requests of the taxation, and they're sort of doubling down with the declaratory acts. The colonists on their part could have accepted the taxes more and realized that we sort of are an aberration in the empire as a whole, and sort of felt it more as sort of doing their part to support the empire in general, which was having these financial problems and troubles. So there's lots of ways that it could have gone down. The colonists could have stuck with more just the boycotting and more of the peaceful aspects of their protests, and not gone to some of those more sort of violent or extreme ends, which certainly caused a lot of the pushback on the side of the British. But at the same time, the British could have taken those signs as a key that, hey, we better back off, otherwise we could end up losing everything, which they certainly did not. So it's sort of like looking at any historical event. It's always fun to sort of think of those what ifs, right? What if this had happened, or what if that had happened? But still, it's sort of on the other side. It's hard to expect people to sort of act outside of their nature, right? It's hard to think that the British government would have completely backed off and said, yeah, we're going to acknowledge that the colonies are special and that we can't sort of treat them the way we're going to treat the rest of the empire. That would have been very very unusual and out of character for them to do, which is essentially what they would have had to have done in order to sort of scale that escalation back. On the other hand, given how sort of fired up the colonists were, how much they sort of saw their own economics at stake in the fight for those the leaders of the protest movement, for how much they had been influenced by that sort of Enlightenment ideology, that it's very hard to see them essentially acquiescing to saying, okay, well, I guess you got us. I guess you can just tax us. And that the arguments that we had been making, we're going to put those to the side to now for sort of the betterment of the empire. It's sort of hard to imagine enough people doing that as well. So in the end, we only know what did happen. And that, of course, was the sort of escalating of tensions all the way to the point of armed resistance, and eventually the beginning of the Revolutionary War. But it's fun to think of, what if things had been different? And certainly we know from the country we live in, sort of how drastic and impactful the war was with the creation of the United States. But I mean, in a whole broad array of areas, you can think of how impactful this could have been. Without the American Revolution, it's doubtful that there would have been a French Revolution. Without the French Revolution, I'm not sure if nationalism would have become as prevalent as it eventually ends up being. And nationalism is essentially the political order that our entire world is organized into today. So you can take all sorts of threads and chase them down for just how impactful this escalating conflict ultimately was, and thinking about sort of the various ways that it could have been prevented or avoided, but ultimately, of course, is going to go the way that we know it happened, and we'll be learning more about that next week, looking at the war itself, how eventually these colonists who are coming into this conflict incredibly outmatched by essentially the strongest superpower in the world, how are they eventually going to become successful in their bid for independence? So we'll be learning about that more next week. All right, looking at our primary source documents for this week, you had the choice of picking two of them. And for the first question, sort of focusing on why Parliament passed the Act and what they were trying to accomplish. And for question number two, sort of looking at what the colonists found objectionable about the acts, how they responded, and if there are any famous colonial Americans took place, so on and so forth. So first of all, for question number one, I specifically mentioned here that the information here is supposed to come from the primary sources. And I felt that a lot of people were just taking the general information that they learned through the week and applying it to this question. So if I did not see direct evidence and examples from the documents, you were going to be losing points on this question. So if you are wondering where a few of your points went, that it could be because you weren't specific enough in bringing in this information. So I'm going to kind of go through these acts chronologically here, and we'll see some of the examples that that were brought up that I thought were good for these, but you could have used a great deal or a number of them for all these. So first of all, we're starting off with the Sugar Act. This is sort of the first attempt to tax the colonies. And the government, British government's pretty straightforward on what the purpose is going to be. Whereas it is expedient that new provisions and regulations should be established for improving the revenue of this kingdom and for extending and securing the navigation and commerce between Great Britain and Her Majesty's dominions in America, which by the peace have been so happily enlarged, and whereas it is just necessary that a revenue be raised in Your Majesty's said dominions in America for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same. So you can see right there that they're pretty much saying this is a taxation for America because we need to raise revenues because we spend a lot of money protecting America and allowing the American colonies to grow. So it sort of sets out their argument and the reasoning for it very, very clearly. As far as what the Act actually did, there's a whole number of provisions. For example, one was for every 100 weight avoirdupois of such foreign white or clayed sugars, 1 pound 2 shillings over and above all other duties imposed by any former Act of Parliament. So raising the taxation on those sugars by 1 pound and 2 shillings. So that was the Sugar Act. Going over to the sort of question number 2 for this one. The Sugar Act actually doesn't have too much of a response. There's some response from the colonial assemblies. It definitely is raising eyebrows, as well as sort of the Currency Act, but it doesn't draw wide-scale protests. For that, we need to get to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, of course, was sort of the next round of taxes that were being levied, and really by this point in time, the colonists were figuring out that the Sugar Act wasn't a isolated event. This was going to be a continuing practice for the British government. The Stamp Act essentially states that it is an act for granting and applying certain stamp duties and other duties in the British colonies and plantations in America towards further defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same, and for amending such parts of the several acts of Parliament relating to the trade and revenues of said colonies and plantations. So pretty similar argument to the first one. You need to raise revenue for your, for the defense and protecting of the colonies. So what the Stamp Act actually do, once more, a number of provisions, one of which was for every skin or piece of vellum or parchment or sheet or piece of paper on which shall be engrossed, written, or printed any special bail and appearance upon such bail in any such court, a stamp duty of 2 shillings. So 2 shillings for procuring or using any of this paper. And of course, this is going to have a profound impact and profound pushback. This is where you see the Sons of Liberty forming. This is where you see sort of John Adams working with that group. You see the large spread organization around boycotts, around pressuring tax collectors and people who are trying to impose this law, and sort of the full force of the colonies put into trying to repeal this, particularly because for a lot of the people it's going to be impacting the most are going to be people who are those doctors, lawyers, people who do a lot of paperwork. They're going to be hit very hard for this. People who own their own business, the craftsmen and the tradesmen who are going to be needing to purchase these paper materials for their own purposes, and they're very much going to be sort of leading this pushback because economically is going to be hurting them the most. Townshend Acts, of course, the Stamp Act is eventually going to be repealed thanks to a lot of those efforts and very successful boycotts. But the British government then sends out the Declaratory Acts, essentially saying, well, yes, we repealed the Stamp Act, but we can still tax you whenever we want. And the Townshend Act was essentially them showing that to the colonists. It didn't take long for them to say, see, we can do this to you. Townsend Act essentially says that it is an act for granting certain duties on British colonies and plantations in America, for allowing a drawback of the duties of customs upon the exportations of this kingdom of coffee and coconuts of the produce of the said colonies and plantations, for discontinuing the drawbacks payable on China earthenware exported to America, and for effectively preventing the clandestine running of goods in the said colonies and plantations. Clandestine running of goods is referring to the smuggling which was occurring. So the Townsend Act is trying to crack down on the smuggling which is happening while still imposing a tax on, it mentions coffee and coconuts. It'll go on to mention things like paint, metals, a whole wide range of just sort of domestic products, which is going to be hitting a much wider percentage of the population, I would say, than actually the Stamp Act was. And once more, you're going to see a ton of reactions to the Townsend Acts. The Sons of Liberty are going to be back at it again. More boycotts, more protests. It's going to be in response to the Townsend Act that John Dickinson is going to create his Letters from a Farmer, which is going to sort of decry these acts and explain why they should be repealed and why they go against essentially sort of what the colonies are all about. Eventually, the Townsend Acts, most of them are also going to be repealed, but there is increasing tensions. It's between this time that the Boston Massacre is going to be taking place, and you can really sort of tell that the colonies are on edge, kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop. What's the British government going to be doing next? The next thing they're going to be doing is the Tea Act. The Tea Act is essentially going to be trying to help out the British East India Company, which is one of the sort of largest mercantilist companies operating in Great Britain, and essentially going to be granting the tea company a monopoly in the colonies, saying if you're going to be buying tea in the colonies, you're going to be buying from the British East India Company. There's not going to be competition. You're not going to be able to have smuggled tea in from other locations. As it says in the document, it is an act to allow the drawback of the duties of customs on the exportation of tea to any of His Majesty's colonies or plantations in America, to increase the deposit of Boa tea to be sold at the India Company sales, and to empower the commissioners of the Treasury to grant licenses to the East India Company to export tea duty-free. So trying to economically benefit the English East India Company. And this is once more going to spawn a lot of protests from the colonies. Even this is actually going to make tea less expensive in the colonies. They're going to see that it is essentially maybe just a short-term thing, that since all the tea is essentially going to be coming through the East India Company, they're going to be able to monopolize it and increase prices whenever they want. They don't like that. Once more, essentially, this is a more heavy-handed economic influence by the British government, which is very much going against what the Americans were, the American colonies were in support of, as far as a sort of like free market economic liberalism. And certainly, once more, they sort of saw it as an infringement on their liberties. And now, essentially, the British government is telling them exactly what kind of tea they have to drink. And it's once more that sort of slippery slope argument that they're making. Well, now, if the British government can tell us this, what are they going to tell us to do next time? And of course, it's in response then to the Tea Act that you see even more protests. The governors of a lot of the colonies realize this is coming. They essentially order the East India Company ships not to enter into the ports, except for Boston. And it's at that point in time you have the protest where the protesters dress up as Mohawk Indians, disguise themselves. Not really for disguising, it's more of a symbolism thing. They sort of saw the Mohawk Indians as sort of representing freedom, which sort of actually dates back to more sort of Enlightenment ideas, that these American Indians are perceived to have sort of this much more free perspective of their governing systems, which to a certain degree is true. They were very much more there's a lot less sort of social stratification and much less sort of top-down decision-making in those societies, although it certainly did not stop the colonists from engaging in war on them and trying to take over their land. But it's interesting that they were using that as sort of a symbol to oppose the British. They invade a number of the British ships, dump the tea into the harbor, which is known as the Boston Tea Party, and that's really where things start to escalate, because not too long after that, the coercive acts are issued targeting the port of Boston, and really that's the coercive acts, sometimes known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, is the British government's attempt to punish essentially Boston for the Boston Tea Party. The coercive acts are broken into multiple different parts. One of them is a quartering act, which once more sort of reinforces the fact that the British troops can be billeted in private locations. For example, it says His Majesty's forces in North America to cause any officers or soldiers in His Majesty's service to be quartered or billeted in such manner is now directed by law where no barracks are provided by the colonies. It's also going to stipulate that any soldiers that are convicted of crimes in the colonies are going to be tried in Great Britain, not in the colonies, which a lot of the colonists feared meant that they would be able to have sort of do whatever they wanted and commit any crimes or atrocities they would want, because they knew that they were going to have a favorable legal proceeding if it came to that. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially said that the governments were going to be appointed by the king from now on, not by the assemblies. Essentially, it states the appointment of the respective governors had been vested in the general courts or assemblies of the said colonies, by repeated experience, been found to be extremely ill-adapted to the plan of government. In that case, sort of explaining why they're essentially arguing that the assemblies, or the governments appointed by the colonial assemblies, are not fit, and says shall be thereunto be nominated and appointed by His Majesty. So these government positions from now on are going to be appointed by the king. So essentially, of course, the people in Boston and the colonies are seeing this as their own colonies, their own governing systems now being completely overridden by the British government. And finally, the British Port Act, which essentially closes down the port until the money is sort of paid back for the money that was lost in the Boston Tea Party. Whereas dangerous commotions and insurrections have been found and raised in the town of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay, His Majesty's customs should be forthwith removed from said town. It then goes on to say that any sort of merchandise coming in is going to be essentially confiscated and not be allowed to enter or leave the town. So those are the coercive acts. And of course, coercive acts are going to set off even more of a chain reaction. There's going to be the arming, the battles of Lexington and Concord, the first big armed resistance in the Revolution. Thomas Paine is going to be coming out with his pamphlet Common Sense, which is going to be urging separation and independence from Great Britain. And of course, not too long after, the First Continental Congress will be meeting to try to, for really the first time in colonial history, have a unified response to a crisis and begin working as sort of one collective group, which of course is eventually going to be issuing the Declaration of Independence and becoming sort of the first governing body of the colonies. So that is how you can see how these various acts are increasingly leading to increasingly severe pushback from the colonies and bringing the two sides closer and closer to what's eventually going to be the American Revolution.